God rarely sends thunderbolts to discipline us when we sin. Often he lets us experience the consequences of rejecting his wisdom. So God's sovereignty doesn't mean that he stops us from ruining our lives. In fact, the reality is pretty sober. He can actually allow us to make horrible mistakes as a result of us rejecting the fear of the Lord, rejecting his words that he's given to us to be a lamp and a light for our path. There's nothing worse than seeing an old man at the end of his life regretting the foolish decisions of his youth. But that's a reality. That's something that can actually happen even to Christians. And so the choices that we make in our youth set our lives on a course that becomes increasingly more difficult to correct as time goes on. In fact, it may even become irreversible. So God gives us his words, especially the Proverbs, to get us back on the straight path before we end up old and embittered with life. Wisdom will guide us, but only if we have the humility to listen. This is Understanding Proverbs. Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 expand upon what we read previously in chapters 1 through 4, and it sketches out an elaborate narrative featuring a young man being seduced by an adulterous woman. In chapter 5, the naive son receives wise instruction from his father so that he will not only recognize but also strategically avoid the pitfalls of sexual temptation. Then in chapter 6, the father imparts some additional wisdom about avoiding other vices that young men often face, such as impulsivity, laziness, and crooked speech. And finally, in chapter 7, we see an expansion upon the father's initial warnings against sexual immorality by talking about the motivations, the tactics, and the deceptions involved in adultery. And all this comes not merely as practical advice to avoid disaster, but more importantly, moral instruction to live in an upright manner before the eyes of God himself, who ponders all of our paths. So let's begin in chapter 5 with the initial warning against adultery. In chapter 5, we see that the father warns his son by preparing him to see beyond the fleeting excitement of the moment to the devastating consequences of his actions. And that's a huge theme in Proverbs, that there's an initial take on the world that your eyes give to you. It's this sensual take. You see this focus on body parts, lips, ears, feet, that the world that's readily apparent to our senses can often be deceiving in this way, that it plays to our desire for immediate gratification rather than seeing the long-term effects of our choices. And there's a contrast between the wise lips that guard knowledge and the seductive lips of the adulterous woman that are smooth and it drips with honey and it causes destruction. It comes out so wonderful, so flattering, and yet it is drawing the man into the very pits of death itself. Wise lips draw people toward righteousness, but the adulterous woman uses her lips to draw men into absolute destruction and corruption. Now, all of the forbidden woman's faculties serve the one end of her own pleasure. You'll notice that she's irrational. She doesn't ponder her own way. She heads toward death, and she's not concerned because she's consumed with her own lusts. All she cares about is her immediate gratification. All she cares about is pleasure. And so that warps her entire being. Her whole body is geared toward and aimed toward and directed toward her own demise, and she wants to take as many people with her. Now, the wise man, by contrast, is going to escape her smooth words by keeping the words of his father's mouth, which ultimately are the words of God. And the father says, don't even go near her house. You have to understand the consequences that are going to follow. You're going to make a wreck of your life. You're going to end up financially destitute. You're going to give your honor and your glory and your wealth to foolish people, to worthless people, to merciless people. You're going to lose all that you've worked for because you have foolishly spent it on this frivolous and ultimately destructive and evil act of adultery. And it's a very sober warning. He's trying to get him to understand the facts of life. I mean, I think on a literal level, he's saying, look, if you commit adultery with this woman, Her husband's going to be mad. Her family's going to be enraged, and they're going to sue you for all you're worth. The husband, and we're going to find this later in chapter 7, might even just straight up kill you. So you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. It seems so innocent, or rather not innocent, but it seems like there's no consequences to this, but the consequences are actually very, very severe. You need to ponder the path of life and understand where her feet are going, because where they're going, to death, is where you will be drawn into. One foolish decision can ruin your life. It can leave you full of regret. Think about how many men ruin their lives when they're enticed by an affair. They get divorced, they lose custody of their kids, they pay tens of thousands of dollars in child support, they lose all respect from their community, and they live with a deep well of regret, and often relationships that are broken beyond repair. It's a terrible reality to live, and there's really no true coming back from that situation. And that's why death is such an apt metaphor. There's no coming back. If you go down this path, if you take this path in the fork in the road and you go towards death, there's no returning. You're going to ruin your life. So don't do it. The stakes are very high. So the father not only calls his son away from the forbidden woman, but towards his wife. Now, it's not clear whether he's speaking to his son about a future wife, a fiancée, or his current wife. But the point is very clear. Take your sexual drive and direct it properly towards godly ends. Specifically, in the covenantal union between a man and a woman in lifelong marriage. So God is not anti-sex, but anti-adultery. He's against using the good gift of sex outside of the sacred institution that he has ordained for that act to be performed within. When sex gets placed in its proper context with a righteous motive, it refreshes the soul like cool water on a hot day. You can hear this imagery of drinking from your own cistern, of a fountain. It's life-giving. It's abundant. It's even intoxicating. There's this wordplay. Instead of being intoxicated by this adulterous woman, be intoxicated by your own wife. It blesses you. This sexual intimacy blesses you with delight and joy, a genuine sharing of your life. And such a powerful gift must not be for public consumption, like a spring scattered abroad or streams of water in the streets. But rather, as Proverbs says, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. The potency of sex to bind two souls together must not turn into a consumeristic affair. And if you see the over-sexualization of our culture, you realize something has gone very wrong with the way that we view sex. We have lost its sacredness. It's so explicit. It's so out there. And Proverbs recaptures the subtlety, the intimacy, and the privacy of sex within marriage, which preserves our proper understanding of marriage, of gender, and of intimacy. And the woman wants to rob that from the man in this narrative. And all this happens before the eyes of the Lord. The adulterous woman never ponders her steps, but God does. So if you live against the grain of his world, don't be surprised when you get splinters. The young man dies for lack of discipline. He's mastered by his lusts, and therefore he lives in a perpetual state of death. He's cut off from the life-giving words of wisdom and doomed to a bitter fate, all because he can't control his passions. And sin may give pleasure for a fleeting moment, but ultimately the wisdom of God triumphs in the end. So this initial warning is followed up by further warnings against youthful vices in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. We're actually going to cut off the end of chapter 6 and put it in with chapter 7 because it fits more thematically. So the first 19 verses, the father continues to advise his son on how to avoid other temptations common to young men. First, he must do everything he can to rectify the consequences of impulsive decisions. So the father says, if you give a foolish security, which is a loan, to a stranger, and that ends up financially hamstringing you, then you need to humble yourself and get out of that arrangement. It's a common temptation to avoid doing the hard thing to make up for our mistakes. But the father urges the son, don't procrastinate. Don't wait a second. Stay up all night so that you can resolve the problem and get yourself out of that foolish arrangement. You shouldn't have made it in the first place, but if you end up making that arrangement, you got to have street smarts. You got to know that you got to beg for mercy from them and do whatever it can, even humbling and humiliating yourself to avoid this terrible situation. You need to know how people act and how people react so you can literally save your own life. Otherwise, people are going to come after you like a hunter, They're going to hunt you down like you're a gazelle or a bird. Don't put yourself in that position. Rectify the mistake immediately. Second, the father warns his son against laziness. He uses the example of a sluggard, somebody who is always saying, I'm going to sleep in a little bit more, I'm going to avoid work, and these little decisions of laziness end up striking him with poverty. It literally assaults him like an armed man. One day, suddenly he's poor. And there's this idea of little habits over time have exponential results. He talks about the ant. The ant is diligent in season, out of season. She doesn't need anybody telling her what to do, but rather she is self-motivated and diligent day in and day out. And because of that, she's able to provide for herself. By contrast, the sluggard, he's folding his arms. He's always saying he's got 15 more minutes to fall asleep or to be sleeping. And initially, nothing happens. He sleeps in, his life's the same. He sleeps in a little more, his life's the same. He's a little bit lazy, he still is provided for. But then one day, it all hits him. The consequences come all at once. It's got an exponential destructive effect that's contrasted with the exponential positive effect of daily faithfulness. Your actions each day, your choices each day are going to mold you into a type of person and also mold your future in a certain direction, either toward prosperity or ruin. Third thing, the father warns his son against becoming a man of crooked speech or a troublemaker. He's an instigator, someone who sows discord among the brothers, who's very manipulative. There's this very physical manifestation, right? He's winking. He's pointing with his fingers. He's contorting his body in a kind of grotesque way, which externalizes the internal corruption of his heart. He's manipulating things behind the scenes with false signals and passive-aggressive motions so he can get what he wants in the end. And the father says, never be this kind of person. Don't be grotesque and perverse like this deceitful person. Because eventually, even though he might get his way initially because of his cunning and his deception, eventually, in the end, calamity will come upon him. And in a moment, he will be broken beyond healing. You can't outsmart God. You can't pull a fast one on God because all your ways are laid out before him. Now, this deceptive person can fool everybody else, but he can't fool the eyes of the Lord. And you can see the irrationality, the foolishness of his conniving, of his attempting to manipulate things, as if he can hide these intentions from God. And all the temporary wins that he accumulates will vanish in an instant when God breaks him beyond repair. It's a terrifying realization of God's judgment, either in this life or for all of eternity. Therefore, remember, don't look at the initial pleasures, but see their end outcome. That's the big idea. Have a perspective in mind. So avoid all the trappings of youthful vices. God hates haughty eyes, lying tongues, hands that shed innocent blood, hearts that devise evil, feet that run and make haste to evil, and false witness that breathes out lies. Again, notice that physical imagery, that body imagery. Sin involves our whole selves. Our members, our body parts are used toward righteousness or toward evil. You can hear echoes of that in the Apostle Paul in Romans 6. How will we submit our bodies? Will we use our bodies toward those evil ends or toward the good and godly ends? And God hates when we use the very bodies that he gave us to do things that are against his will, that are grievous to his own heart. And then the father goes back to the topic of adultery. I think he understands that this is probably going to be at the forefront of his son's mind. How do you deal with seduction? How do you deal with sexual immorality? And that's from 6:20 to 7:27. You need to bind and tie the word close to your heart so that it's engraved in your heart. Remember, the heart is the seat of the will. It's the place where all of your deepest desires, allegiances, and affections rest. And so the father's saying, if you want to avoid adultery, but also all kinds of seductive sins, you need to have God's words in your heart, internalized, so that they become a part of who you are. And if you do this, God, through his words, will lead, protect, and counsel you in all the areas of your life. It will literally be a leader, a protector, and a counselor. And this preserves us from the seductive words and alluring beauty of the adulterous woman. Don't desire her beauty in your heart. Don't have your lusts run your heart. Let the word of God, let righteousness, the upright way, be what guides you in your life. And you really see the clash of two narratives, two takes on the world. The Father is trying to give his Son the proper take on the world, that it is God's world, that he is a moral and just God, and he will visit upon his people the consequences of their actions, even if it doesn't happen immediately, and that you need to follow the upright path. That's the reality. And then there's a counter narrative by the adulterous woman that actually, no, you are someone that she desires, that she has spread out the finest linen for you, the best spices and oils for you. Her husband's not home. You can make love all night into the morning and there will be no consequences. That she has sent an offering up, that she is somebody who is religiously devoted in a sense to her passions, and she lusts after this man. She's desirous of him. She's wandering out in the streets and she grabs him and seizes him and kisses him. This physical imagery is painting another narrative in the man's mind that she wants you, she desires you, and that you can have all of this ungodly pleasure with none of the unfavorable consequences. That's a counter narrative. That's a counter story. And the Father is saying, when this stuff starts to happen, when you hear her smooth words, when you hear her entice you with no consequences, that should send off an alert in your mind that you are being seduced. You are being drawn like an ox to the slaughter, like an animal about to be killed into your own death. And so the Father wants the Son to get wise to the tactics of the seductive woman. Can a man carry fire next to his chest and his clothes not be burned? Well, no. Don't be a sucker when it comes to sin. Just as the adulterous woman works craftily and strategically to ensnare the man, so the young man must learn wisdom to outmaneuver her and avoid her trap. And the best way is to stay away from her house. Get away from her. Don't think that you can dabble with her and not get burned. Proverbs gets really practical. If her husband finds out, he's going to kill you. If you commit adultery, you're sentencing yourself to death. He says a prostitute costs only a loaf of bread, but a married woman costs your life. Now, this is not a promotion of prostitution. That's obviously sinful and wrong, but rather saying that at least for a prostitute, you have to consider the cost. It's not as readily apparent with a married woman. In fact, the whole seduction is that there is no cost to sleeping with me. There's no cost to our fornication together. And that's the danger, is that she seems so free, so there's no strings attached. And yet, it's going to be a much more severe punishment. In fact, the Father says, sometimes you can understand why a thief would steal. All right, maybe he's hungry, he's starving, and he steals. And people can say, you shouldn't have done that, but we can understand. And yet, even for those understandable situations, he still gets punished. Well, how much more for a situation in which you commit adultery, in which there is less of an empathy for you? Well, how much more will you be punished for that? And so adultery has this hidden cost that is not readily apparent in the moment, but is devastating in the end. And so this woman, she preys on men who lack sense, who don't see the end result of their action. The Father looks out of his window and he basically says, this is kind of like me observing the world. He looks out his window and sees a naive, foolish man, and he's wandering around at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night. Now, technically, he's not sinning. There's nothing wrong with wandering around at night at 2 a.m. But the Father's like, this guy's a joke. He's an idiot. It's providing the oxygen that fuels the fire of sin. And for some of us, we have to be very savvy about that. The best way to avoid temptation is to avoid temptation. The moment when you start to be seduced is the time when you're the weakest. So why not avoid that street altogether? People even talk about this with people recovering from drug addictions. That not only do they have to get off the drugs, but they have to change their friends, they have to change the routes they drive to and from work, because there's a whole ecosystem that feeds that vice that they need to get away from. So there might be some instances where I don't want to be seduced. So even though these things in themselves are not sinful, it would be wrong for me to allow myself to be in the vicinity that gives oxygen to the kind of vice and sin that I'm trying to put to death in my life. So that might mean taking radical action. It might mean changing your environment so you don't fall into the snares of sin. It's a very important savvy, street smarts that the Father's trying to instill in his Son. And flattery is such a huge part. I mean, she is playing to his ego. She dresses like a prostitute, and she's loud and wayward. She's running around in the streets looking to commit adultery. So she is very upfront with what she's all about. She has no respect for her husband. She goes about in the streets, doesn't care at all. She says he's away, he's on a business trip, he's not going to care, or he's not going to know, rather. He will care in the end. And she presents herself as a twisted version of wisdom. She goes out publicly into the marketplace and she's looking for men to seduce. And it's a counter to wisdom, who goes out trying to call out and say, will anyone listen to my wisdom? She's going out, this adulterous woman, and saying, will anyone be my lover? And she seizes and kisses the man. She works on his want to be desired. She says, I've been looking for you. I've been focused on you. I'm all about you. And this is the trap. She singles him out, makes him feel wanted. But what's the reality? Well, the father tells him, in her backyard is a whole pile of corpses. It's a trap, right? She has killed many, many men, and she herself is headed again toward death. There will be consequences. So guard your heart against her ways. Prepare yourself now so that you can avoid even having to fight against her seductions. Prepare yourself now and be strategic and savvy. Have the street smarts to recognize the signs of seduction so that you run in the opposite direction. Don't let a single smooth word come into your ears, but rather have the words of God engraved on your heart. Listen, strain your ear, pay attention to wisdom rather than folly. And this expands beyond just sexual immorality to anything that seduces us, whether it would be politics, whether it would be our work, whether it would be just superficial, frivolous activities. There are many ways in which sin vies for our attention, with things that may not in themselves be sinful. And we have to think about the ways in which we are tempted. The oxygen that gives these vices the air that keeps it alive. We need to be very vigilant about this and take life seriously. Fear the Lord. Ponder your steps. Don't think you're the exception that will escape the clutches of death when you head down the path of sin and folly. Recognize the signs. Take seriously the stakes so that you might live a life of joy and prosperity and peace, rather than ending up an old, bitter man wishing he had just listened.